So a lot of these things must advance and must continue. Otherwise, there's never going to be that significant change. And the fact that 2 decades has elapsed since the firewall letter and we're back to where we were there is evidence of this. So I do want to talk about a little bit of the specific part of this, because when there is a proposal afoot like the one that was in the firewall letter, and like some of the ideas that are there now, it's easy to get caught up in the abstract of, well, Western alienation, Western independence, Alberta separation, all of these things, without dealing with the meat of it. I talked at the beginning of the show about equalization payments, probably one of the biggest frustrations and the biggest grievances that the people of Alberta have with their treatment. $20 billion to $40 billion that Alberta is sending that is purely for the betterment of other provinces in Confederation. Imagine if, for example, New York was forced to subsidize Idaho, or California was forced to subsidize Wyoming, or whatever the case is. I mean, they would never stand for that, because in the United States, each state has as kind of its birthright the ability to govern its own affairs, the ability to bring in its own revenue, the ability to do all of these things that are necessary for the betterment of the state. But in Canada, we take for granted that the successful provinces, the haves, must subsidize and bankroll the less successful ones, the have-nots. And I don't know if this is just from this very caricaturistic version of what it means to be Canadian, about, oh, we look out for our neighbors and all of that. But in actuality, what it means is that provinces like Alberta, who have had a great deal of oil revenue and energy success, but are still economically hurting in many ways. The true Alberta success has not translated if you look around at suicide rates, at commercial vacancy rates, at drug use, domestic violence, all of these metrics that show, as True North dealt with in a documentary a couple of months ago, that show a Calgary in crisis, yet Alberta is still profiting in such a way that it can bankroll the have-not provinces. And there's something about this that is very unjust, because it means that a province can never quite get ahead if the first $20 to $40 billion that it brings in belongs to the federal government for the purposes of wealth redistribution.
All right, let's go over this idea that New York does not subsidize Idaho. So I don't know if Andrew Lawton has ever lived in the States, or any of the wexit people have ever lived in the States or been to the United States, or thought about the United States in any meaningful way. But if you actually Google it, you can see that by the total federal taxes paid by state, you can see that California, New York, Texas, Florida, certain states pay more in absolute terms and by per capita terms. And as it turns out, there's federal programs such as Social Security that pay out to specific states on a per capita basis more than the other states. Some states are older, for example, and they will be receiving more in Social Security funds. It's been known for quite some time now that there's in terms of federal revenue, there's donor states that commit more money than they get back. And in terms of a balance of payments, the Rockefeller Institute of Government says that New York is getting, 21 billion in the red, right? Whereas Idaho is actually a beneficiary. Idaho, right there. And then on a per capita basis, New York is losing $1,000 per person with all the people that it has, and Idaho is gaining $3,000 per person by individual income tax and direct payments, grants, contracts, and other things. So, and then if you look at labor force participation rate, Idaho's labor force participation rate is actually lower than New York's by a percentage point. And then the median household income in New York is higher than Idaho. So what this means is Idaho is paying less Social Security wages, less payroll taxes, and less income tax into the federal government. The more people in New York have topped their payroll tax rates, and they have paying higher marginal rates. So when it comes to building an aircraft carrier, which costs about $12 billion, you could bet that it's bankrolled more by the people of New York than the people of Idaho. And when it comes into federal programs, you can have something like the Idaho National Laboratory is famously involved in nuclear research and has a $1 billion budget. Now, I would say it could be that an independent Idaho would fund their own nuclear laboratory, but I would bet that federal money makes a difference here. New York City has its own social problems, much like Calgary or Edmonton or areas of Alberta might have, and New York, in its own right as a city and a state, could say it's having trouble getting rid of these social problems because it's paying so much money to the federal government, right? It's giving too much to the federal government. It has a hard time taking care of social problems because of money going to the federal government, to Washington, and then ultimately to Idaho. But the fact is, New York is doing okay, and if New York wants to fix its subway or wants to fix its airport, like JFK is not a great airport, they have the means to. They have the means to find the money. They can find the money. There is money in New York, and would be ridiculous of New York to blame federal income tax or Social Security as a program as its main issue for failure to raise money and fix its urban areas or fix its transit or what have you. So, but this is a common refrain coming from Alberta because Alberta politicians likes to externalize blame, and Alberta conservatives in Alberta and Western Canada do not like to take responsibility for anything. And that's it.